Mr. Papandreou, I mean, I think what was quite, obviously it's striking and kind of stirring to hear your words, in a sense saying that people are misreading the situation of Greece, and I think maybe being unfair to Greece, that Greece has done a lot more work than we like to think, or that many people have said in this crisis. But you know what a lot of people have been saying for a long time and are saying much more in the last few weeks, that this was a huge mistake. Greece should never have gone in the euro. Yes, it was about trying to become a serious country. That was why Greece joined the euro, and it has failed that test. That it should now give, however sad it might be, should now give up on that dream and let the rest of the eurozone go ahead. You know that's what people are saying all over Europe. What's your response to that?
Well, there's a lot that's being talked about around Greece, and Greece has suddenly become the center of analysis by all kinds of
we're all experts.
Experts,
now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is part of one of the actual challenges of our world today. I mean, the fact that I hadn't lived through this, but being front page and number one issue on television every day for a year, for 2 years, where everybody knows what the solution is, but everybody is also predicting doom and default and euro exit. I've heard that now for 3 years. It hasn't happened. We've managed. Now, we got into the euro as with the same terms as everyone else, transparently and openly. Now, whether the euro has its problems, I'll agree it does. You very much mentioned this.
Although even the problem with that is that after the fact, even many of the European statistical body decided that some of those transparent numbers were not so transparent.
We can get into that. I think the basic problem was that we had a government just some years ago that, in fact, did fix the numbers, and that really undermined the credibility of Greece. But Greece has really made major changes and has worked hard. I said that the OECD says that we're number one in reforms. We have problems, and I said that from the very beginning. We have a state that's not run well. It's a state that's come out of a dictatorship some years ago, and we didn't go through our glasnost and our perestroika as others did. It's quite clientelistic. That needs modernization. We really need to change that. But this is where I would say that we came in government with the hope, there was great hope for change. And all of a sudden the crisis came and we were punished. So people lost this enthusiasm for change as austerity came in. And I think that one of the problems here was, which I was trying to communicate to many of my partners, and some of them were convinced, but we didn't have the means. I said, let's change Greece before we try to cut down all these wages and pensions and so on. We need to make some cuts there also. But there was trying to cut the deficit in such a short time without making major changes. For example, like revamping the tax system so that we can deal with tax evasion, really hurt the people, and they felt it was very unjust.
I mean, you said something...
And politically it was very
difficult.
difficult.
And you talked about, and I mentioned the referendum in my introduction, I mean, you talked about the Greeks needing to own their fate. I was going to ask Niall about this in a minute, but I mean, what's the risk that they're about to disown their fate?
Well, I had proposed that it would be better to go to a referendum where the dilemma was very clear. You know, in elections you have a wider choice, and of course you have all kinds of parties professing all kinds of solutions. I think some of these solutions are very fanciful, but not realistic. But many voters may vote for them. If we actually put the real dilemma to a test, where we said, okay, do we want to be in the euro? If we want to be in the euro, these are the prerequisites. A yes or no? I think the Greek people would say it's difficult. We may want to struggle and try to change the terms, and we may be able to change them slightly, but let's do it. I think we would have won that referendum.
I mean, you're one of the many people who worried right from the start about the euro, not just on economic grounds, but also that it was this elite project that people had not necessarily bought into, and certainly in countries like Greece and Portugal didn't necessarily understand the implications of being as competitive as Germany forever once they joined this monetary union. I was struck by the most striking thing that you had in your presentation was your assertion that it just was not possible for Greece to leave, that there was too much, the interconnectedness of the banking system helped by the European Central Bank just made this unthinkable. what if it may not be thinkable in financial terms, but if the populations in countries like Greece are so disengaged from this project, isn't it still possible politically, even if it's disastrous economically?
Well, the danger in this discussion is that it's a little bit like talking in 2008 as if all the problems in the US economy were due to Lehman Brothers. This is a systemic crisis of European banking and European public finance. And Greece is a symptom of a much more profound malaise that affects the entire monetary union. So that's the first point to get clear. And I entirely agree with Mr. Papandreou. We've wasted a great deal of time and energy moralizing about Greece and other South European countries as if the only problem was the work habits of Mediterranean peoples. I've heard this from eminent German economists once too often. My response is always, this is a European-wide problem. It is as much a problem of your surpluses as it is a problem of the Greek, or for that matter, Spanish or Portuguese deficit. I think that the election that's going to happen in Greece is still very hard to call. The polls are all over the place. But my instinct is that the Greek people don't want to exit. And they are not going to be persuaded, ultimately, by populists who claim they can somehow stay in the Eurozone, have the benefits of Euro membership, and default on the obligations that previous governments entered into. It's just not credible. You can't have it both ways. I think what we're seeing politically is a game of chicken between Berlin and Athens, with German politicians pretending that they really believe that Greece can leave, and Greek politicians pretending that they really believe that Greece can leave. And in truth, in the game of chicken, usually both cars swerve. I think they're going to swerve. I think ultimately there is no mandate, if you just look at opinion polls, for Greece leaving the euro. What people want is some relief from a German-mandated program of austerity that doesn't appear to be delivering any prospect of growth in the foreseeable future. Here there's a rich irony, and I think it is helpful to think historically about this. You know, which country between the wars was saddled by a large external debt, had austerity imposed upon it by international agreements, saw its political establishment fragment, saw splinter parties gaining ground in vote after vote, and finally saw a complete breakdown into default and the failure of democracy? The answer is Germany. And what the Germans are unwittingly doing is having Greece reenact their history of the Weimar Republic. Like the Weimar Republic, Greece today has all kinds of problems: an unaffordable welfare state, public employment which is completely out of control and inefficient. Structural reform will work in Greece. It will also work in Italy. It will also work in Portugal and in Spain, just as structural reform has worked when it's been tried in North European countries, just as structural reform worked in this country when it was implemented by the Thatcher governments. But it won't work this week. When you talk to Germans, I was in Berlin last week, you would think that this was a multi-year policy. You know, oh, what we need are 3 or 4 years of structural reform. Well, that's true, but that's not going to solve the short-run problem of a bank run.
No, and they will compare. They're comparing completely different things because they feel that they have been through their structural reform, 10 years of almost no growth in wages and other difficult changes in Germany. The trouble is their version of that, they were still growing. They were still able to export to the rest of the world, to the rest of Europe. It's a completely different order of magnitude what Greece is being asked to do. But I want to ask you, I mean, even the Financial Times has spoken about the political implications of what's going on in Greece and possibly in other countries in the so-called periphery that are also quite young democracies. They have talked, you know, the sober pages of the Financial Times have talked about the possibility of coups, of police not functioning, serious riots on the streets. I mean, a real breakdown of society in Greece as a result of what might happen in the next few weeks. Do you think that is a possibility? Is that because that, of course, does conjure up images of the 20s?
Well, I would agree with Niall's instincts about where Europe is going to go. That this is we may even be in a collision course. I think Germany and Greece will swerve so that we don't crash. And of course, I think Europe will see that there's a major danger of disintegration, and there's too much cost in disintegration. Not just Greece, but a wider disintegration, because there will be contagion, I believe. However, it is different than a Lehman Brothers issue, because we're talking also about political systems, and this is something which I very often mentioned from the very beginning with Angela Merkel. I said, let's Europeanize this problem from the beginning. And I said, let's not have it, every little detail has to go through every single parliament, and every little change has to go again through every single parliament, even though that's democratic, maybe, but it is not really European. What it meant is that every single issue became an issue of debate, of populist debate, and a lot of rhetoric, a lot of bad feeling between countries during this period.
You know,
so what happened is that in Greece, it's not just a question of a sense of economic security. There's also a question of pride. I mean, the Greeks really feel, we are really being beaten upon. For what reason? I mean, what did we really do? What was so bad about us? And I think there's a sense of injustice there and the same thing in Germany. Now, if the Germans think the Greeks are lazy, which is wrong statistically, then of course they'll say to Merkel and to any German leader, why are you giving this money to the Greeks? Well, they're not, it shouldn't be given to them. So there is a political question there, which I think we have to deal with in a more bold way and get beyond this sort of going back to this nationalism in Europe, which is really undermining the basic idea and not giving the political legitimacy for us to move forward in a more federated, if you like, type of a move.
Just on that point, actually, some of you may have been a little skeptical at the assertion that Greeks work harder than Germans, but if you measure hours and days worked per year, the Germans work the least of almost any people on the planet. In fact, the average German works 1,000 hours less per year than the average South Korean, which is why when you go on vacation, the Germans are already there. It's not the Greeks who are there, it's the Germans who are already there. And when you go home, when you head to the airport, the Germans stay. It's like, Auf Wiedersehen. This is not, this is true.
Actually, Neil, we are there. We are there dancing Zorba and drinking ouzo so that everybody can have a great time.
That's right. You are the holiday destination and they are on vacation.
So if you're not, I mean...
There's a serious point, though. A serious point here, which I
The serious economist point is if you're working fewer hours, it probably means you're more efficient, not less efficient.
So to be absolutely nerdy again, since it's a Google conference, what happened is very interesting. When Delors and his supporters made the case for monetary union, they said, look, this will promote economic integration. If we have a single currency, that will encourage integration. And it didn't happen except financially. What's very interesting is that when you look at unit labor costs, which is a really important measure of labor market competitiveness, there was divergence. German unit labor costs barely moved after 1999. Those of the periphery soared. Everybody said essentially, oh, we're in a monetary union with the Germans. Now we can earn money like the Germans without commensurate gains in productivity. So that's really, if you dig down, the problem with the labor market. It's not really about working hours, it's about unit labor costs.
And all that tells you is that both the supporters and the critics of monetary union were both right, because they both basically said it was a stalking horse for much closer integration, for fiscal integration. Now, for those who were critics, they said that's why you didn't want it, because it would lead you down that path. And of course, the supporters, it was an important way of putting that horse before the cart.
Do you remember back then a man named Nick Ridley, whose son happens to be here? That's a shout out for Matt's dad. In 1990s, uncle, correction, uncle, relative. He made the point in an interview with The Spectator, this was just after the Delors report, that the real point about monetary union was that it was going to lead to German domination of a federal Europe. And he had to resign for that. But it was true. It was absolutely true. Implicit in the project was a federal system, and implicit in a federal system was German domination. We see that now.
We're running out of time, but I want to get back to now, but also the historical perspective. History says you may get these changes. This may force integration because people will see it's the only way out. But it also says you only see the necessity of those kind of difficult things when you've had a massive crash, when you've had a horrible accident that reveals to you the need to do these things. do both of you think that what will actually need to happen is something pretty awful, even worse than has already happened in Greece, in or out of the euro, to teach the rest of Europe the importance of integrating? Would you worry about that?
I would hope not. Let me put it this way. I think, if you
But
live
there's
in...
room for a lot of accidents, aren't there?
There is room. And I think what you were showing in the very beginning, this Jenga, we have created a construction which is balancing right now. But with a strong wind that blows, there are all kinds of risks. A risk here, and that's what I lived through. We were doing everything we could. We were changing things. We were moving ahead. But a little risk here, a rumor there, could really turn things around. That's why I think we really need to move and strengthen, whether it's called the firewall, the ECB, growth policy, more federation. I would add, because Niall raised a very interesting point, in a federation you have certain dominant powers. I think we need to democratize Europe too. This would mean, and I proposed this many years ago when we were talking about the Constitution, why don't we elect a European president from the people? It could be with, like an American system where you have certain weighing of votes, where some bigger countries obviously will have somewhat of a different weight. But let's also be able to have European-wide referendum. These are the kinds of things which I think we need to do if we're moving in this direction.
But how do you make people feel more in favour of European integration when all it means to them at the moment is austerity? How does that not politically undermine all the things that you need to have happen economically?
I think there's an answer to that question which is not widely understood. What we are seeing is a gradual delegitimization of national politics. Established national parties are losing credibility. Public esteem for national politicians is at all-time lows in Italy. What we're seeing in Greece is essentially the loss of the legitimacy of the dominant parties of the post-dictatorship period, and that actually paves the way towards a federal outcome. If you look at the Eurobarometer, it's always been very interesting to me that there's a perfect correlation, inverse correlation. The more you despise your national institutions, the more pro-European you become. And so a crisis at the national level, which you see not only in the south, but look at the Netherlands, caretaker government. Belgium, when did they last have a government? All over the Eurozone, national politics has fallen into profound disrepute. And that, I think, paradoxically paves the way to the kind of federal Europe that we're going to get. If we don't go down that route, and this is really the bottom line, we're going to get such a huge financial crisis as a result of whether it's Greek political recklessness or German stubbornness, that politicians currently on the bridge will feel pretty much like they were the crew of the Titanic when it hit the iceberg. The danger is very great, it's very imminent. When I talk about a bank run, I'm not just talking about Northern Rock, I'm talking about something comparable in its magnitude with the 1931 crisis, which, as I said, ushered in the second half of the Great Depression. The stakes are really high here. And that's why I think people will pull back, that's why I think the cars will swerve, but there's still a 20% probability, roughly, that they collide. And a year from now, we'll be having a very different discussion about who caused the disintegration of Europe.
So book your seats now.
Can I just add something to that?
Yes.
I would agree that being a national politician in the sense of having lived through a crisis and Europe living through this crisis, the construction of Europe when it was hit by this crisis or any other crisis is being tested. But what is being tested also is that we at the national level, and this is a very important question for democracy, don't have the capability to solve our problems if we don't work together.
But at the moment, Europe doesn't either. That's the trouble.
That's right. That's why we need to reconstruct or construct a stronger Europe and a more democratic Europe. This is important because what happens is that you have an alienated population because they are looking to the national politicians and they're saying, why aren't you solving my problem? And the national politician is basically strapped for solutions because of the wider types of problems, the challenges our world is facing. So we do need to work together. We do need to work together now and more quickly. And we do need to do it on a way of greater respect, I would say, and solidarity.
Well, thank you very much. I was glad that we could, you've managed to end at least the last few words of this bit of the session on an upbeat note. But I think I hope we've persuaded you that it was a good thing to discuss for a third year. I'm not sure that we've made you feel any more optimistic about it. But thank you very much to George Papandreou and Niall Ferguson.